This is the second of 3 videos for this week. So the first video was an intro to counterargument. This one is how to respond to counterarguments. And the last one will have to do with argument structure. So if you haven't watched the first video, watch that first before watching the rest of this. Pause this right now, go look at that video because that one tells you what a counterargument is and it gives you some detail that's going to be important before you get to how to respond to it. So now that you've watched that video, let's talk about ways to respond to a counterargument. There are 2 main ways. One is a rebuttal, and the other is a concession and value shift. You can kind of combine these in certain circumstances, but it's helpful to think of these as the 2 main things. A rebuttal is where you say that the counterargument itself is wrong. So you have some evidence supporting the counterargument, you bring it up, it undercuts your thesis, and then you say, actually, that counterargument's not correct, and you bring up some new evidence, some other evidence to prove that it's not true. A concession and value shift is where you say you first concede the counterargument by saying that some or most or all of the counterargument is correct, but then you shift values and say, even though it's correct, it doesn't invalidate the thesis, and you explain why. So I found that the best way to learn this is to go through some examples. So I have an example. Here's the claim, the same one we used in the first video, the one we've used a bunch of times this semester. Donuts are the best breakfast food for busy college students because they're cheap, convenient, and widely available. The counterargument, donuts are unhealthy, and an unhealthy food can't be the best breakfast. So it doesn't address a reason, but it does undercut the thesis, which says they're the best. This counterargument says they're not the best because they're unhealthy. One option here would be to offer a rebuttal. So a rebuttal would have to say that the counterargument itself is incorrect. So it's saying they're not the best because they're unhealthy. The rebuttal would be, actually, they are healthy. That's not what I would recommend you choose in this particular circumstance because the evidence isn't really in your favor. Most donuts are not very healthy. If you decided to use a rebuttal, you'd have to find some evidence to counter that claim, to say, they are healthy. So you'd have to find, I'm sure out there somewhere, there's some healthy donuts or some recipes for healthy donuts. You'd have to find some of that evidence in order to offer a rebuttal. But again, with this particular claim, because the evidence suggests they're mostly unhealthy, I wouldn't recommend a rebuttal. I would recommend a concession and value shift. So remember, concession, you're conceding some or all of the counterargument. In this case, you're conceding just about all of it. You would say, it's true that the vast majority of donuts aren't healthy. That's a concession. But then you have to value shift. So they say, because it's unhealthy, it can't be the best breakfast food. And then you say, sure, it's true that the vast majority of donuts are unhealthy, but college students are often very healthy and should prioritize cost, convenience, and availability over nutritional value. So you're saying, yeah, that counterargument's true, but they're wrong that it invalidates the thesis because it's less important than my reasons. So there's other reasons to think that the thesis is still true. The concession and value shift, I think the word concession, where you're conceding part of it, sometimes spooks people, and I think that's worse than a rebuttal. Not necessarily. You should just listen to what the evidence says. If the evidence says that the counterargument itself is wrong, offer a rebuttal. If it says the counterargument's right, then you should concede and you should value shift to show that your thesis is still true. One thing that's important to note is that sometimes you kind of do a hybrid where you accept some part of the counterargument. So you concede that part in value shift, but then another part of the counterargument, you offer a rebuttal. So it can get a little murky, but it's helpful to think of, at least even in parts, that you can offer a rebuttal, which is a rejection of it, or a concession, which accepts it, and then you shift values. Last note I want to make on this, do not forget to do the value shift. It happens more than you would think, where people just concede. They say, that's absolutely right. Donuts are terribly unhealthy. And then they forget to say the part about why it's still the best breakfast food. And if you do that, you weaken your paper because you leave your audience with the suggestion that your thesis might be invalid, and then you don't come back and defend it. So make sure that, if you offer a rebuttal, just talk about why it's wrong. If you offer a concession, make sure at the end after you concede to have a value shift.